I never expected my quiet neighbor from upstairs to change my life, but the night she hugged me so tight I couldn't breathe, I realized she wasn't just my neighbor anymore, she was someone I couldn't let go of. When I first moved into the building, I wasn't expecting much. It was a modest apartment complex, tucked away on a quiet street where the only real noise came from the rustle of trees against the windows and the occasional hum of traffic in the distance. My place was small, but it felt like mine, bare walls waiting for memories, empty shelves that still smelled faintly of fresh paint. And then there was her. I noticed her almost immediately. She lived in the apartment above mine, and though she wasn't loud, her presence was impossible to ignore. The first time I saw her was in the stairwell. She was carrying a paper bag of groceries, the kind that looked like it could give way at any second. She balanced it easily, though, one arm steady, the other brushing back a loose strand of hair from her face. She was striking, though not in a way that demanded attention. It was more subtle, like the kind of beauty that reveals itself slowly the longer you look. Her hair caught the light from the stairwell window, soft and slightly tousled. Her eyes, I remember thinking they looked calm, as if they'd seen enough of the world to be both tired and endlessly patient with it. She smiled when she saw me. Not a wide, practiced smile, but a small, genuine curve of her lips, the kind that lingers just long enough to stay with you after she's gone. I muttered a polite hello, and she answered with a voice that was low, warm, and composed. It carried a kind of quiet confidence, the sort that made you instinctively want to lean in just to hear more. Over the next few days, I found myself noticing her in little ways. From my balcony, I could sometimes see her on hers, watering the plants she'd lined up neatly in clay pots, their leaves catching the afternoon sun. She always moved with a kind of grace, not hurried, as though she'd learned the art of taking her time. Even when she was just shaking crumbs off a towel or adjusting the chair she liked to sit in, there was something deliberate about her. And there were the small details. The faint scent of jasmine that drifted down the stairwell after she'd passed. The echo of her heels against the floorboards above me when she crossed her living room late at night. The soft glow from her window when the rest of the building was dark. I didn't know her name yet, but she already felt like a presence in my life. Not a loud one, not something I could put into words, just, there. And though I told myself it was nothing, I realized I was waiting. Waiting for the next time I'd hear her door close upstairs, or catch her in the hall, or see that small, almost secret smile again. Something about her made the air feel a little different. Like the building wasn't just walls and ceilings anymore, it was alive, because she was in it. The first real conversation we had started in the simplest way. She knocked on my door one evening, holding an empty mug in her hand. "Do you happen to have any sugar?" she asked, with an apologetic little smile. Her voice was steady but not rehearsed, like she wasn't used to asking for help. I remember standing there a second too long, trying to think of something clever to say, before I nodded and invited her inside. My kitchen was embarrassingly bare, a few mugs, some half-filled shelves, but she didn't seem to notice. Or if she did, she was kind enough not to comment. I poured some sugar into a small bowl for her, and when she reached out to take it, her fingers brushed mine. It was nothing, really, a fleeting touch. But it stayed with me longer than it should have. She looked around as though she was quietly cataloging the details of my space. "You just moved in?" "Yeah," I said. "A couple weeks ago. Still trying to figure out where everything goes." She smiled softly, setting the bowl against her hip. "It took me months. I still haven't figured out half the switches in this place." It wasn't much, but it was easy. Her presence filled the small kitchen with something warmer than just conversation. I found myself listening more to the sound of her voice than to the words themselves, low, even, touched with that calmness that seemed to follow her everywhere. Over the next few weeks, there were more moments like that. Small, unplanned. She caught me in the stairwell one afternoon struggling with a heavy box of books, and before I could protest, she slipped her hands under one side to help. I noticed the faint crease at the corner of her eyes when she concentrated, the strength in her grip. We set the box down together just inside my doorway, and when she laughed, a short, unguarded laugh, it filled the hallway in a way that made me wish it would last longer. She told me pieces of her life in fragments. That she worked long hours, that she liked to unwind by reading near the window at night. Sometimes, if I came home late, I'd see the silhouette of her profile lit by a lamp, her head bent over a book. It was strangely comforting, knowing she was there even when we weren't speaking. There were small hesitations in her, too. When I asked if she ever went out with friends, she shrugged. Sometimes. But, not as much these days. Her eyes lingered on me a second too long after she said it, as though she wanted to say more but thought better of it. It was in those moments, the pauses, the almosts, that I felt something quietly forming between us. Not loud, not obvious. Just the beginnings of a closeness neither of us dared to name yet. And every time she walked back upstairs, leaving behind a faint trace of coffee or perfume in the air, I realized I was already looking forward to the next excuse to see her again. The thing about living in the same building is that you can't help but cross paths, but with her, it began to feel less like coincidence and more like something quietly inevitable. Sometimes I'd step into the laundry room late at night, half asleep and carrying a basket, only to find her already there, folding neatly, humming faintly under her breath. Other times, I'd hear the sound of her balcony chair scraping across the floor above me, and when I went out to water the little plant I kept alive mostly by accident, she'd already be there, leaning against the railing. One evening, it happened again. The sun was dropping low, painting the sky in soft strokes of orange and violet. I went out to breathe in the cooler air, and there she was, already seated, a cup of tea in her hand. She glanced over at me, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Long day?" she asked. "Always," I said, sinking down into the chair beside hers. The balcony was narrow, so narrow that when we both sat there, our knees brushed. Just barely, but enough for me to notice. Enough for me to wonder if she noticed too. I told myself I could move, that it would be the polite thing to do, but I didn't. And she didn't either. We talked in the kind of easy way you only can when there's no rush. About little things, books she'd been reading, the neighbor's dog that barked at shadows, the weather that couldn't decide between summer and autumn. But woven between those simple topics were glimpses of something deeper. At one point, her voice grew quieter, her gaze drifting off toward the horizon. "You know, people always think I'm strong. Reliable. The one who doesn't need anything. But it's tiring sometimes, holding yourself together for everyone else." I turned to look at her, surprised by the rawness in her tone. She didn't often let her guard down. The evening light caught the side of her face, tracing the soft lines of experience there, and in that moment she didn't look untouchable at all. She looked human. Vulnerable, even. I wanted to say something that would matter, but the words felt clumsy in my throat. So instead, I let the silence sit between us, not empty, but full, like a pause that belonged. I shifted slightly, letting my arm rest closer to hers, not quite touching, but near enough that she could close the distance if she wanted. She didn't move away. Her fingers toyed absently with the rim of her mug, and though her eyes stayed fixed on the fading light, there was a softness in her expression, as though she was allowing herself, just for a moment, not to be strong. And sitting there, knees brushing, silence stretching, I felt it, that quiet pull, the fragile thread tying us closer together. It wasn't love. Not yet. But it was something. And I knew it was only growing stronger. The storm came in fast. One moment the sky was a restless gray, the next it was breaking open with heavy sheets of rain. The wind pressed against the windows, and the building groaned as though it were carrying the weight of the weather itself. I sat in my apartment, listening to the steady drum of raindrops when, all at once, the lights flickered and went out. I had just reached for my phone to use as a flashlight when I heard a knock at my door. Not hurried, but steady, like she knew I'd be there. When I opened it, she stood in the hallway, a candle in her hand, the flame throwing a soft, golden glow across her face. Her hair was slightly damp from the rain, a few strands clinging to her forehead. She gave me a small, almost sheepish smile. "I didn't want to sit alone," she said. Her voice carried over the distant roll of thunder, low and unguarded. I stepped aside and let her in. The sudden presence of her, the faint jasmine of her perfume mixed with the earthy scent of rain clinging to her, made my apartment feel warmer, fuller. I found another candle and lit it, setting it between us on the coffee table. Shadows danced across the walls, softening everything, making the room feel smaller, closer. She spotted the bottle of wine on my counter and raised an eyebrow. "Is that your plan for surviving the storm?" I laughed, maybe a little nervously. It wasn't, but it could be. So we poured 2 glasses, and the night stretched in a way I hadn't expected. The rain tapped steadily against the glass, thunder rumbled every now and then, and in that cocoon of flickering light and storm sounds, she began to talk. Not small talk, not the kind of polite conversation we'd shared before. But real things. Wounds. Memories. She told me about someone she once thought she'd spend her life with, someone who had left when she needed them most. She didn't cry, but her voice wavered here and there, the words carrying a weight that time hadn't completely eased. I didn't interrupt. I just listened. And when her words trailed off, I reached out, hesitantly, almost afraid she'd pull away, and rested my hand gently over hers. Her skin was cool, her fingers slightly tense at first, and then they loosened, curling ever so slightly as though holding on to mine. She didn't say thank you. She didn't need to. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was necessary. Healing. For a long moment, we just sat there, the storm raging outside, the candle flickering low, her hand beneath mine. And I thought to myself how strange it was that in a building filled with walls and separate doors, 2 people could sit together like this and feel as though the world had narrowed down to just them. And in that closeness, I felt something shift. Something fragile, but undeniable. The storm eventually began to ease. The thunder grew faint, the rain softened into a steady whisper against the windows, and the candle between us had burned low, its light no more than a trembling pool of gold. We hadn't spoken for a while, and I found myself reluctant to break the quiet. There was something sacred about it, the kind of silence that doesn't demand to be filled. She set her empty glass aside and stood slowly, smoothing the hem of her cardigan. For a moment, I thought she was about to say goodnight and disappear upstairs, leaving me with nothing but the echo of her presence. But in the doorway, she hesitated. Her hand rested on the frame as though steadying herself, her profile outlined faintly by the dying candlelight. She turned back to me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something caught between resolve and uncertainty. Her eyes searched mine for a moment, and then, as if something inside her gave way, she stepped toward me. Before I could move or even think, her arms slipped around me. It wasn't a polite, neighborly hug. It was something heavier, fuller. Her body pressed close, her arms tightening around my back as though she needed to anchor herself. My breath caught, not just from the sudden closeness, but from the intensity of it. Her cheek rested against my chest, warm and soft, and I could feel the steady beat of her heart against me. The faint scent of rain clung to her hair, mixing with the familiar trace of jasmine. It filled my lungs, left me dizzy. I realized, with a sudden clarity, that I didn't want to breathe too deeply, afraid that even the smallest movement might break the moment. I lifted my hands slowly, unsure at first. Then I settled them gently around her, one resting against the small of her back, the other brushing along her shoulder. She didn't flinch. In fact, I felt her hold tighten, just slightly, like she was saying without words, "Don't let go yet." Time stretched strangely inside that embrace. It could have been seconds, or minutes, but all I knew was that nothing outside of it mattered, not the storm, not the dark, not the walls of the building around us. Just the quiet steadiness of her pressed against me, her breath falling softly against my shirt, the weight of everything she wasn't saying but was somehow letting me feel. When at last she loosened her hold, she didn't step back right away. She lingered, her hands sliding down my arms before letting go, her gaze flicking up to meet mine. There was something unspoken in her eyes, gratitude, longing, maybe even fear. I couldn't tell. She gave me a small, almost apologetic smile. I should go. And though I nodded, part of me wanted to stop her, to keep her there just a little longer. Because in that hug, in the way she held me as if I were the only thing keeping her steady, I felt something shift inside me that I couldn't ignore anymore. After that night, something in the air between us changed. It wasn't obvious, no one else would have noticed, but I felt it every time I saw her. A new weight, a new pull. The hug had left a mark, and though we never spoke of it, I knew she felt it too. The very next morning, I ran into her on the stairs. She was carrying her work bag, dressed neatly, her hair still damp from a shower. She gave me a smile, but it wasn't the easy, neighborly smile I'd seen before. This one lingered, just a little too long, and when I returned it, I caught her eyes flicker away quickly, almost shy. We exchanged the usual pleasantries, long day ahead. Don't forget your umbrella. Simple words, nothing that should have mattered. Yet even as she spoke, her hand brushed lightly against my arm while passing, and the briefest contact sent a quiet spark through me. Neither of us acknowledged it, but I carried the sensation with me the rest of the day. From then on, every meeting felt charged. In the hallway, she would pause as though she wanted to say something more before retreating upstairs. In the laundry room, she reached across me once to grab a bottle of detergent, her shoulder grazing mine, and though the touch lasted only a second, I felt my breath catch. The hardest part wasn't her touches or glances. It was the silence that followed them. She'd act as though nothing had happened, but the faint pink in her cheeks betrayed her. And I tried to play it safe, tried not to read too much into it. Yet at night, lying in bed, I kept replaying that hug in my mind, the way she'd held me like she couldn't let go. One evening, I found her outside on the shared balcony again. She was leaning against the railing, a glass of water in her hand, her expression softer than usual, as though she'd been lost in thought. When she turned and saw me, her lips curved into that quiet smile. "You always come out here at the right time," she said. I joined her, close enough that our shoulders almost touched. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of rain left behind from the afternoon. We talked about ordinary things, the weather, a book she was reading, but beneath it, there was a pause, a lingering hesitation neither of us wanted to name. When I laughed at something she said, she looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen before. It wasn't amusement, it was warmer, softer, like she was allowing herself a glimpse of something she normally kept locked away. For a heartbeat, I thought she might reach for me again. But she didn't. Instead, she sipped her water, turned back to the night sky, and let the silence stretch between us. A silence filled not with absence, but with everything we weren't yet ready to say. And in that silence, I realized the truth, we had crossed a line we couldn't uncross. Even if no one else knew it yet. It was a quiet Thursday evening when it finally happened. I had just returned from work, balancing a few grocery bags in my arms, when I heard her door open at the top of the stairs. She appeared, arms full of her own bags, her hair pulled back loosely, a few strands falling around her face. We met halfway, both of us juggling our loads, and without hesitation I offered, "Here, let me take some of those." She gave me that small, knowing smile, the kind that always seemed to carry more than it showed. "You'll regret it," she teased, handing me 2 heavy bags. "They're full of oranges." I might have gone overboard. By the time we reached her door, we were both laughing softly, slightly out of breath. I set the bags down just inside her apartment, and for a moment I expected the usual, a polite thank you, a smile, and the quiet closing of the door. But instead, she lingered. Her hand rested lightly on the edge of the door, her eyes studying mine with a softness that made my chest tighten. Then, almost hesitantly, she asked, "Do you want to come in for tea?" The words were simple, but the way she said them carried weight. An invitation, yes, but also something more. A choice. Inside, her apartment was warmly lit, the faint scent of citrus and jasmine in the air. She moved about the kitchen with practiced ease, her hands steady as she set the kettle to boil. I sat at the small table by the window, watching her, the way her cardigan slipped slightly from her shoulder, the way she tucked her hair back absent-mindedly. It struck me how natural it felt, being here, as though I'd been waiting for this without even realizing it. We talked as we always did, but the conversation drifted into softer places. She asked about my family, about my dreams, and I found myself answering more honestly than I usually did with anyone. She listened intently, her gaze steady, and when she spoke of her own hopes and regrets, her voice was quiet but unflinching. At some point, she moved from the opposite chair to sit beside me. It wasn't a grand gesture, just a simple shift, but when her shoulder brushed mine, I felt the now familiar rush of warmth. Neither of us moved away. The tea sat cooling on the table, forgotten, as she leaned gently against me. Her head found my shoulder, resting there with a kind of trust that felt heavier than words. I let my hand slide over hers where it rested on her lap. Her fingers turned, curling softly against mine, holding me in return. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. The quiet closeness between us was enough. Looking at her profile in the dim glow of the lamp, I realized this wasn't just about a hug in the hallway, or chance conversations on the balcony. This was about choosing to stay, choosing to be near each other in a world that so often pulled people apart. And as the night settled around us, her upstairs window no longer felt distant when it glowed. It wasn't just her light anymore. Somehow, it had become ours. If you enjoyed this story and want more slow-burn romances like this one, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. And if this story touched you, share it with someone who loves a good, heartfelt romance.